Hello everyone, it's Josh. Welcome to Story Time. Today we're going to be reading Mr. Silly by Roger Hargreaves. Funny story, or silly story with this. I'd actually already filmed this video and was about to upload it for all of you to see, but I guess I just felt like deleting the video before I uploaded it. So here we are again, reading it again. I guess Mr. Silly and me just felt like having some fun and deleting the video. Oh, awesome stuff. Awesome. Alright, get comfortable, get ready, because we're about to delve into story time. That's right. Mr. Silly lives in Nonsense Land, which is a very funny place to live. You see, in Nonsense Land, everything is as silly as can be. In Nonsense Land, the trees are pink, and the grass is blue. Isn't that silly? Pink tree. Blue grass. It's funky. In Nonsense Land, dogs wear hats. And do you know how birds fly in Nonsense Land? Nope, they don't fly forwards, they fly backwards. It is a really very silly place indeed, which of course is why Mr. Silly lives there. Check out that dog with a hat. Nice and fun. Mr. Silly in fact lives in quite the silliest looking house you have ever seen in your whole life. Have you ever seen a sillier looking house than that? That does look a little bit silly. It's interesting. Kind of looks like a P and an H and an N all combined. It's an interesting house. Now this particular story is all about the Nonsense Cup. You see, in Nonsense Land each year they hold a competition, and the cup is awarded to whoever has the silliest idea of the year. Mr. Silly has never won the cup, but each night, lying in his bed, he dreamed about winning it. There he is there. Big smile on his dial. His hat covering his eyes. Slumped down on his head. In order to win the Nonsense Cup, Mr. Silly realized that he would have to think up something remarkably silly. He pondered over the problem one morning at breakfast. Incidentally, you may be interested to know what Mr. Silly was having for breakfast. He was having a cup of coffee, which he put a spoonful of marmalade into. After that, he had a cornflake sandwich. And to finish, he had a boiled egg. But being Mr. Silly, he ate the shell as well. Isn't that a silly breakfast? If you look at the table closely there, you can see his silly breakfast. You've ever had a boiled egg with the whole shell as well? Definitely don't do that. Definitely don't. It's really silly. Anyway, this particular breakfast time, Mr. Silly was thinking how to win that cup. He remembered 2 years ago, the cup was won by Mr. Ridiculous. He won by wallpapering his house, which sounds very ordinary, but in fact, Mr. Ridiculous had wallpapered the outside of the house. That is very, very silly. And Mr. Silly remembered last year when Mr. Foolish won the cup. Mr. Foolish was a friend of Mr. Silly's, and he'd won the cup by inventing a car. It was quite a normal car, apart from one thing. It had square wheels. Isn't that silly? Don't think that car would drive very well. It'd probably just drive like this. And sitting in the car, it might be a little bit of a bumpy adventure. I don't think I could handle that. That'd be full on. Mr. Silly thought and thought, but it was no good. He even had another cup of coffee with marmalade, but that didn't help either. So he decided to take a walk. Off he went, leaving his front door open so that he wouldn't have burglars when he was out. On his walk, Mr. Silly met a chicken, wearing Wellington boots and carrying an umbrella. Wouldn't it be silly if you didn't wear Wellington boots and carry an umbrella? He said to the chicken. Meow, said the chicken. Because animals in Nonsense Land don't make the same noises as they do in your country. I don't know, but where I'm from, chickens don't say meow, that's for sure. On his walk, Mr. Silly met a worm wearing a top hat, a monocle and an old school tie. Wouldn't it be silly if you didn't wear a top hat, a monocle and an old school tie? He said to the worm. Quack, quack, said the worm. Hey, you want to have a look at the worm? Looking all silly, tying a top hat and monocle. Next, Mr. Silly met a pig wearing trousers and a bowler hat. Wouldn't it be silly if you didn't wear trousers and a bowler hat? He said to the pig. Moo, said the pig. Isn't that silly? It was the middle of Mr. Silly's walk that he had his idea. It was a beautiful, silly idea. The silliest idea he'd ever had. He hurried into town and bought himself a pot of paint and a paintbrush. The day of the great awarding of the Nonsense Cup arrived. A huge crowd assembled in the city square to see who was going to win the cup. The King of Nonsense Land mounted the specially built platform. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said to the crowd in City Square, "it is my pleasure today to award the Nonsense Cup to whoever has had the silliest idea of the year." That's the king there, the King of Nonsense Land. I'm trying to look. Doesn't look super silly or nonsensical at all. He's got a normal crown, but maybe he looks a little bit like Santa Claus. Maybe that's why he's silly. I don't know. One of the silliest ideas of the year, continued the king, is by Mr. Muddle the farmer. He has managed to grow of all things a square apple. Look. Well done, Mr. Muddle. He felt sure that he was going to win. That's a pretty silly idea, so maybe he will. "However," said the king, and Mr. Muddle's face fell, "we have had an even sillier idea entered by Mrs. Nincompoop." It was a teapot, quite the silliest teapot there had ever been. The crowd broke into thunderous applause. "I therefore have great pleasure," announced the king, "in presenting the Nonsense Cup to..." Before I turn the page, I want you to have a look at that teacup. Do you think that teacup would pour tea very well? No. Just then he looked up and stopped in astonishment. Now in the middle of City Square there is a tree. It's always been there, and it was at this tree that the king was looking in astonishment. "What?" he cried. "Has happened to that tree?" Everybody turned to look. The tree had green leaves. Bright green leaves. Not pink leaves like all the other trees in Nonsense Land, but green. There was an amazed silence. "It was me," piped up Mr. Silly. "I painted all the leaves green last night when you were all asleep." Wow, that tree just looks normal to us. Green leaves. But everybody in Nonsense Land, that looks silly because they're pink leaves. There. "A green tree," exclaimed the king. "Who ever heard of a green tree?" "A green tree," shouted the crowd. "How silly!" And they started to applaud. Mr. Silly smiled modestly. The king held up his hands. "I think," he said, "that this is the silliest idea I have ever heard of, and therefore I award the Nonsense Cup to Mr. Silly." The crowd cheered and cheered. Mr. Silly went pink with pride. A trophy is as big as Mr. Silly. Wow. So he won the Nonsense Cup in the end. He's been dreaming about that for a long time. And a bird perched high up in the branches of the silly green tree looked down. "Woof," it said, and flew off backwards. There we go. Mr. Silly from Nonsense Land. Thanks so much for reading the story with me today. I hope you liked it. If you enjoy these, please click the bell below and subscribe. And I'll be back below with another story really, really, really soon. Bye for now, but not forever.